what did the beatification mean? I talked to some Salvadorans. They said, well, you know, we're very grateful that we have a Salvadoran beato, you know, Salvadoran blessed, especially somebody like Romero. But there was also an element there of the vindication or the exoneration of Romero. There's an analogy between the beatification of Archbishop Romero and the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus. And the reason why the apostles were in and out of jail all the time for proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus is that Jesus was convicted and executed as a sinner, as a bad person, as a criminal. But so the proclamation of his resurrection is saying that no, God has raised him from the dead, this Jesus, and they're constantly referring to this Jesus whom you turned over to the Romans and had executed on a cross. This Jesus whom you condemned, God has raised from the dead. So it's like an indictment of his executioners. It was a courageous denunciation of the injustice of his execution. And they prayed for courage because they were being thrown in jail for saying this. You know, and they weren't just saying that, oh, this person, you know, somebody was raised from the dead. No, they're saying, this Jesus, whom you condemned as a sinner, that is the authorities, the local authorities, the Jewish authorities, whom you condemned, this Jesus, God has raised from the dead. And they needed courage for that. So they kept praying for courage. They kept praying for boldness. They got released. It was Peter and John got released from jail at one point. They came back to the community and they started to pray together. What did they pray for? They didn't pray for an end to the persecution. They did not pray that they not be sent back to jail. They prayed for courage to speak boldly. This is the little Pentecost. This comes shortly after the big Pentecost, which was the coming of the Spirit in the form of tongues and fire. This is known as the little Pentecost. And so they prayed for the courage to speak boldly. And the Spirit came upon them, and they went out and spoke boldly. That's, you know. And they needed boldness because they were risking being thrown in jail all the time, every time they proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus. Why? Because Jesus was a bad guy. He was a sinner, he was a criminal, false prophet, and so forth, according to the authorities of Jerusalem. And so it was an announcement of the triumph of the victim over his persecutors. Now this is all in faith. I mean, this is all in the world of faith. Just a couple of examples of that. Peter, on the very day of Pentecost, the big Pentecost, God raised this Jesus. Okay? Of this we are all witnesses. Therefore, let the whole house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Messiah. This Jesus whom you crucified. They constantly include that. They constantly refer to the crucifixion. Another day in the temple, Peter said, God has glorified his servant Jesus, whom you handed over and denied in the Father's presence when he inside you. You denied the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you. They're really kind of, laying it on there. So you denied the holy and righteous one, and now we know that he is the holy and righteous one because God has raised him from the dead. That's what they're saying. The author, and still keeping this, the edge. There's an edge to their proclamation of the resurrection. The author of life you put to death, but God raised him from the dead. Of this we are witnesses. And it was understood as by the accused as a denouncement of the injustice of the execution. Then they order them not to preach that, not to proclaim that message of the resurrection of Jesus. And then they make the famous statement, which we can link back with Romero's statement to the soldiers, where the apostles said, we must obey God rather than people. That's a very subversive statement in the Acts of the Apostles. You had him killed by hanging him on a tree, and repeating that. You put him to death, God has raised him up. We obey God, we are not going to obey your orders to keep us silent. So I'm suggesting this analogy. It's not a perfect parallel because we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus and the beatification of Romero. But I think there is a relationship. So when the people in El Salvador over all these years were saying, Archbishop Romero lives, Romero vive, lives, that's an affirmation that he is alive in God. Or when the same with the Maryknoll sisters. Two were Maryknoll sisters, one was an Ursuline sister, and the other, Jean Donovan, was a young lay missioner, were brutally slaughtered in El Salvador the same year that Romero was killed, 1980, December 2nd, 1980. They were raped and murdered. But when you say the sisters live, the Jesuits, the 6 Jesuits and 2 women were killed at the Jesuit University in San Salvador years later, 1989, after the war had been going on. The war really escalated after the assassination of Romero, and then continued in a very bloody fashion throughout the decade of the 80s. In 1989, the Jesuits were killed at the university, and the 2 women along with them. But there would be this constantly, martyrs of they're living. So that came across to the government of El Salvador as a challenge. They're saying they're living. We put them to death. They were bad people. And now with the beatification of Romero, I think that there is a great, you might say, an ecclesiastical exoneration, an ecclesiastical vindication of Archbishop Romero. Because not only was he opposed by the oligarchy, the super rich of his own country, the government, the military of his own country, he had a lot of opposition within the Catholic Church. As I said before, the other bishops, except for one, there was one bishop who was more or less on the same wavelength as Romero, understood and supported him. The other bishops were against Romero. They didn't want to be on the outs with the army, the government, the military. They said, oh, we keep quiet, we don't, go along with this. And from Rome, he felt suspicion from the Vatican, from the Pope, actually, John Paul II. Romero did not feel supported. He did not feel interested. He felt that he was suspect, he was under suspicion, and that he just couldn't count on the spiritual support from the Vatican. So that's why, again, that's part of the impact of the beatification, because all the opposition that he had received from the hierarchy of El Salvador and from the Vatican, you might say, now that was all reversed. It's all changed. Now he's blessed, and he's going to be officially declared a saint. So, he was acting according to his conscience, he was doing what was right, he is a model, because when you declare somebody beato, blessed, or saint, you're saying, well, he or she is a model for Christian behavior, Christian life. So I think that, again, the meaning and the impact of the beatification was very strong. Again, I would say that it's important when we consider people like Archbishop Romero, or when we look at Pope Francis, his visits in South America, his manner of doing things, his words here in the States, his way of embracing people, of respecting people. I think it's important to see that we're being called to live Christian lives. We're being called, invited, and shown a way, in a sense, but not that we have to imitate him exactly, or we imitate any of these people, but that we're being called to live our lives in a way that is according to the gospel and according to the commandment of love of neighbor. And we can do things, we can change, we can live according to the way of Jesus. I think that's what these saints, you know, they're people. They're ordinary people with their own hang-ups and selfishness and fears and problems, but they changed with the grace of God, and I think they're examples to us that we can live lives of faithfulness to the gospel. Archbishop Romero was, again, a man of the church, so a person who promoted the Catholic social doctrine, which is not exactly revolutionary, but it can be very critical of the capitalist system as we know it, or as it can become, where you can have the excesses of capitalism, the maximization of profit, now the Pope has referred to the deified market, that is, the market mechanisms, the whole system, as deified, that people make a god of it and say that it is unquestioned, unquestionable, unchallengeable. You just have to go along with that. The laws of the market are supreme, and they should not be tampered with, and it will all work out for the benefit of the common good. Well, I think we're saying that there are serious fallacies in that argument. And Romero, I think, saw things that way. He was very critical, again, you say the excesses of the economic system, the huge inequality in the disparity in the ownership of land in this country, peasants being paid starvation wages. I think basic goodwill, you see that you can see the goodness of people and the possibilities of change, and you know that unless we relate to one another in a respectful and caring way, we're never going to have real communication. But it's very hard. It's love your enemies, in a sense. Love your enemy. Some people say, well, you don't have to like your enemy. Well, that's probably true. You can't generate a liking for somebody if you don't have it. But love your enemy in the sense of recognizing him or her as a human person with their own conscience, their own experiences, their own dignity and rights, and to try to communicate with that person and to be open to a dialogue as well. I think somebody like Romero, even for all his very powerful language, he, as in that final sermon, the final Sunday sermon, referring to the soldiers as my brothers, and you're slaughtering your own campesino peasant brothers and sisters, just appealing to their better lights, their better instincts.